Chapter 9 deals with biodiversity and kind of species extinction, looking at how does extinction happen and how can we prevent species from going extinct. So nice case study on polar bears. I love polar bears, near and dear to my heart because that was my alma mater's mascot. In 9.1, page 191, definitely understand the differences between background extinction rate and mass extinction. So mass extinctions happen when many more species are going extinct than the background extinction rate. So keep that in mind. A lot of scientists argue that we are in the midst of a sixth mass extinction, which is the first caused by human activity or the first anthropogenic mass extinction. So that can be debated, but there's definitely evidence that extinction rates are higher now than the background extinction rate since the last mass extinction. Excuse me. So we have some examples of endangered species right here, and doing a project on or a quick little project on endangered species. So we'll look at some of those in more detail. They're endangered. They're also threatened or vulnerable species that are not endangered yet, but could potentially become that way. These characteristics in figure 9.3, super important to understand, a great thing to focus on in this chapter. So even if you can't remember the specifics about one species, if you understand these characteristics and how they're often seen in endangered species, that will be helpful. And we tend to focus on animals, but plants face extinction at much higher rates than other animal species. So do keep that in mind. So why should we care about species extinction? 9.2 focuses on that. And besides the fact that, pandas are cute, etc., 4 major reasons. Ecological services that could be provided by species. Economic services as well. It can have a very long recovery time for when species are extinct to, then, speciation increases after an extinction event. That's great, but it takes a very long time. And so when you think about the stability of an ecosystem, it won't recover that quickly. And then, of course, there are ethical arguments that could be made as well. All right, most important thing from this chapter probably is in 9.3. That's the HIPCO acronym. So H is for habitat destruction, which is probably the major cause of extinctions. I is invasive species. P, population growth, referring to human population growth, which kind of can then affect all of these others. The second P is pollution. The C is climate change. And then O is overexploitation. So habitat fragmentation results in islands, right? So if we think about the theory of island biogeography, we can see how that could cause problems. So we'll look at, the effects of corridors and things like that, connecting these different islands. Figure 9.10 does a really nice job of showing how habitats have changed from, looking at former ranges in purple to the current ranges today, and that's mostly due to habitat destruction. Invasive species, 9.11 has some great examples of invasive species. It's always good to know at least one that was deliberately introduced. Usually they're deliberately introduced either for an economic purpose or like ornamental. They look pretty with plants. And then accidentally introduced, these are the hitchhikers, if you will. Kudzu vine is a great example of a deliberately introduced plant species that went awry. In terms of preventing more damage from invasive species, funding research so we fully understand what they're doing, international treaties to prevent the import and export of these species, inspections and bans on species coming in. This is why if you've ever traveled to like Hawaii, for example, you aren't allowed to bring, fruits and vegetables, seeds, nuts, anything like that with you. Discharging ballast water, that's the water that's stored in ships, and sometimes if they're discharged in a port, then they can bring in all sorts of aquatic hitchhikers. And then, of course, education. Pollution, we get into this idea of bioaccumulation versus biomagnification. So bioaccumulation is the increase in the concentration of a chemical or a substance in the organs and tissues in one organism. So we see this often with fat-soluble chemicals. So they'll be stored in the tissues. They never break down. They aren't released in urine or anything like that. Biomagnification is the increase in the concentration of these chemicals or toxins at higher trophic levels. So basically, when a chemical bioaccumulates within the tissues of an organism, that means that when that organism is eaten, all of the chemical goes into the next trophic level, and then it stays there and accumulates in that trophic level as that organism eats more and more and more. And then we see that happen again, and so on. Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, published in 1962, brought the attention to the general public of DDT, which was a very popular insecticide, fat-soluble, so it both bioaccumulated and biomagnified. And what happened is it built up in the tissues of birds, and then it made their eggs much weaker. And so that was one of many effects, but those weak eggs then led to a decrease in the number of birds that were hatching, hence Silent Spring. We have an example here, another example that you may have heard before, colony collapse disorder, which is basically killing off honeybee hives. So there are a lot of potential causes. They're still researching this. Is it pesticides? Is it disease? Is it stress? Is it cell phone signals? Who knows? So things you could do to help. You could plant gardens with native plants, native to your area. This can help bees and butterflies, and then it helps local food crops because bees serve a very important ecological service. And then, fun fact, at Harvard, there's some scientists who invented robo-bees, which could potentially be used for artificial pollination. They're almost like nano drones. So, something interesting. All right, overexploitation is dealt with in some of these photos here, like we can see in 917. So why are rhinoceroses endangered? Because humans like their horns, basically. So it's pretty sad, really, what's going on there. So poaching, if you've heard of poaching before, typically for skins, ivory, like the rhinoceros, the elephant, pet trade, bushmeat, that's what we can see in figure 918. Traditional healing or medicine, shark fins are used for that. Pangolins, if you've ever seen those, they look like little anteaters with scales. Their scales are believed to have, medicinal properties in traditional medicine. But these are all things that can cause some major problems. Also, as the human population grows and we start to live in closer proximity to other animals, the likelihood of disease spreading also increases. This is how HIV and AIDS first spread to humans. This is how Ebola has first spread to humans. So this is something that is a problem as well, beyond just saving the species. So we have a couple of laws that you looked at for your summer assignment, but that show up here. So CITES, or CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Basically, it bans the trade of all listed species between countries, but it's not universally enforced. So that's the biggest problem with these international treaties. If certain countries or areas are not enforcing them, then it doesn't do as much good. In the United States, we have the Endangered Species Act. This identifies and protects species both in the U.S. and abroad. So how do we protect species with a United States law? We can look at trade and ports, things like that. And it puts the protection of that species ahead of economic interests. And so that's why some people have issues with the Endangered Species Act. So basically no, you cannot cut down this forest for logging because there's an endangered species that lives there. Okay. Chapter 10, which we'll look at next, deals with a little bit more with protected areas and national lands and what those can be, how those can be used. And then other solutions besides just laws, there are gene banks and vaults and botanical gardens and zoos, which all can help to preserve biodiversity. Fun fact, the Global Seed Vault, which is in Norway, which contains seeds from kind of plants all over the world, experienced some minor flooding in May 2017 when the permafrost actually melted, something they never thought would be a problem. We have a case study here about California condor. Was affected by lead from bullets, and lead is a neurotoxin. We'll discuss that in Chapter 17, Unit 4. But when your population gets really low, that decreases genetic diversity, and that can be a problem. So education is super important for protecting species. Then the last thing from this chapter that will come up again is the precautionary principle. This is the idea of better safe than sorry. So if you don't know what the effects of something will be, if you don't know if it has negative effects, maybe don't do it unless you're positive. So that is Chapter 9 in a nutshell.